Okay, so it's a good afternoon from me in the UK. Obviously, if you are a subscriber of my main channel, The Sports Buff, and you may recognise me more from my sports videos that I do, but occasionally I do content on this channel. So there's a lot to discuss at the moment, politically and socially. There's a lot of issues going on. Obviously, we've seen the cost of living crisis at the moment, which is a big concern for a lot of people. The cost of living crisis, not just here in the UK, but across Europe, North America, Australasia, South America. There's a big cost of living crisis, and obviously the conflict in Ukraine is a big driver of that, and also the recovery from COVID as well. There's a change in the labour market, staff shortages. There's a lot of reasons why we are in the position we are in, um, and it's it's really quite interesting, to be honest. The fact that we are in this situation. There, so yes, the cost of living crisis is a big thing. Obviously, Queen Elizabeth II has passed away. King Charles III is now the new British monarch and head of the Commonwealth. Liz Truss is now the new British Prime Minister. The mini budget, the announcement by the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng to do with cuts to the higher rate of tax, the reversal of the national insurance rise, which is similar to Social Security in the US, and the instability in the financial markets in London, and the weakening of the British pound against the dollar and the euro has caused some concerns and a raise in interest rates. So, if you are someone who's got savings account, that's a good thing. If you're someone with a mortgage or a payment plan or anything, that's a bad thing. So, say if you're someone with like a credit card or payment plans, anything on finance, it's a bit of a bad thing. Um, and it's created a lot of political discussion here in the UK. Obviously, Parliament is on a secondary recess because it's party conference season. So a lot of the politicians are busy at conference. Obviously, we had the Labour Party conference, which was disrupted by Liverpool City Council's decisions to do a traffic-free day without figuring out A, we've got a major political party having their political conference in the city, and B, the infrastructure of the public transport in the city is shit. Anyone who's been to Liverpool will know that the infrastructure for public transport is not what it was, let's say, in the 1950s, where there was more railway stations, more bus and tram routes. Liverpool, the public transport infrastructure is not great. It's a good way to describe the public transport infrastructure in the city of Liverpool. And they very quickly abandoned the idea of a car-free day before lunchtime. It created carnage, um, absolute carnage. Now, obviously, it's the Conservative Party conference right now taking place. Obviously, Liz Truss is Prime Minister, has only been in the job a short period of time. And there's already calls to call an early general election. There's polling being done in regards to the political situation. And it's very interesting because, as someone who's studied politics and as someone who's voted in every election apart from one since I've been eligible to vote since the age of 18, and I'm now nearly 33, I have voted for all three major political parties. I make no secret of that. And the situation I find with British politics is the first general election I was eligible to vote in was in 2010. And this is, I think, a big turning point politically in this country. I voted for the Lib Dems in 2010. In 2015, I voted for the Conservative Party. I voted in local elections for all three major parties in the UK. At the last general election, I voted for an independent because there wasn't a Lib Dem candidate standing in the constituency in which I lived at the time. And every subsequent local election since then, I voted for the Lib Dem candidate. So I'm more of a centrist, would be a good way to describe me politically. What's happening right now, and what's happened over the last 6 years since the Brexit vote, is the two main political parties have basically, the leadership of those parties was very pro EU. The membership was very pro Brexit. And what's happened is that the left wing of the Labour Party took control for a brief period with Jeremy Corbyn, and the right wing of the Conservative Party took control of the Conservative Party, at which point you end up with identity politics playing out. Hello, Jordan. Nice to see you. I thought I would do a live stream on this channel because I've been watching a documentary series about the Labour Party and the structural issues the Labour Party faces. Because Labour is obviously leading in the polls right now in regards to if there was a general election called tomorrow, so we'll have 6 weeks of campaigning. Labour's currently polling record polling numbers. And as a Lib Dem voter, for most of my voting record, and as someone who's very frustrated and doesn't see either of the two main parties as party stakes. Well, I was watching this documentary, so I stumbled across it by accident, and it's to do with a leak of confidential papers, internal papers with the Labour Party, very similar to the Panama Papers leak, which was to do with tax avoidance and financial crimes. The Labour Party papers leak has been leaked to Al Jazeera. Now, this comes at a time when the Labour Party was having their annual conference up in Liverpool. It's very interesting because what's come out is basically they are playing the polarizing identity politics, and actually structurally they did undermine Jeremy Corbyn, and there is they're not they're not the party that I think people think they are. There is a racist, sexist, misogynistic element to the party, and it is all out there in the public domain. That the papers have now been leaked to the press. You can get a freedom of information request. They're out in the public domain. They are in the public domain now. What's very interesting is the mainstream press here haven't really covered the leak of internal documents to do with disciplinary processes and how they dealt with the anti-Semitism scandal that was going on at the time under Jeremy Corbyn. Keir Starmer is a slimy character, basically. Obviously, the Conservative Party has basically proven itself to be utterly incompetent and just more than just sleazy. Boris Johnson was sleazy, but utterly incompetent already under Liz Truss. Do you want some cheese? I remember that speech. And what is very, very interesting is the Lib Dems have been exceptionally quiet at this time of year, which I find very, very surprising. And I'm about to sort out my membership with them. So the two biggest parties in our country for seats of MPs are quite frankly unfit to govern, in my opinion. Because Labour's solution to the cost of living crisis is all very, very short term, a one-off windfall tax. The Conservative solution is make the rich richer and everyone else has to pay for it. But the way they've gone about their tax policy and I've got the bloody sunlight and their announcement with this mini budget has been completely shambolic. And of course, it's going to affect everyday spending in the shops, as I have found out. Now, I'm a big fan of my Nutella. Local shop near me was selling it for £1.70 a month ago. It's now going for £1.95. So in the space of like a month, that's a 25p increase on the small pots. That is madness. So when they're talking about inflation being at the percentage it is, that's a complete and utter load of tosh. I don't know where they get these inflation numbers for inflation from, but it's not correct. Obviously, the conflict in Ukraine with what's going on in Eastern Europe is having an impact on certain prices of certain products, and that includes gas and oil, which Russia has a lot of, and other former Soviet republics also have a lot of, and of course the pipelines go through Russia into Eastern Europe and the Baltic. We've seen that domestically the politics is a mess. So feel free to ask any questions you want in regards to that. Obviously, I can't speak on certain local issues that you may have locally, let's say in the West Midlands, where you're from, Jordan. But whack in a question. Like, my viewpoint is that if you were to reduce taxes, there is a way you could do it, and it's something that you will see in every single pay packet, um, and every time you go to the shops. One particular tax you can get away with cutting that could actually help the poorest in society, and that's VAT. I don't know if you will remember this. Back when the financial crash happened in 2007, 2008 to 2010, the financial crisis we had all those years ago when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, one of the solutions they did. Um, okay, so the gas prices. Well, the international energy market is interesting. Now, yes, we do have gas reserves and oil reserves in the North Sea. We also have, actually, ironically, shale oil reserves in Dorset. You'll see if you go to Dorset or the West Country holiday, you'll see 12 donkeys doing this, which you associate with Saudi Arabia. We have the oil donkeys pumping them out, and it's to do with the wholesale market globally. And of course, what people fail to understand, a lot of people fail to understand, is oil and gas is paid for in US dollars, and the pound over the last 6 years is a lot weaker than what it was pre the Brexit vote and pre um, uh, Boris Johnson becoming prime minister. So the stronger the pound, the weaker the dollar, the cheaper it actually is to buy and sell oil and gas. So the weakening of our currency against the US dollar has an impact. Now, we as a country only import 5%. However, however, there has been a shortage in production at times because during certain points in the COVID pandemic, we needed to use less. We were using less at the time because factories were on, stand down, offices were on stand down, working from home. So the lockdowns we had over 2020 meant we didn't build up reserves. That's the interesting bit. Is yes, a proportion of what we pay and get comes from Eastern Europe, but we our reserves weren't filled up. So that's basically what's happened there. Other commodities that are actually fueling the price rises as well. The gas and electric price. There were subsidies paid out during 2020. There was the furlough scheme, amongst other support packages that the government put out. Now, obviously, if you obviously you both watch my sports channel, we know what's happening with Worcester Warriors and Wasps with their financial woes, and that is partly in part is back in 2020. I don't know if you were subscribers to the channel or if you viewed the content at the time. Was that some sports, apart from football, got government loans? Rugby league, cricket, rugby union, they got government money, and they have to pay that money back. And Worcester and Wasps are struggling to pay that money back. So certain industries were subsidised during 2020, and so there's certain things going on financially. My view is I'm a renter, so I have views on this. There were two a month ago. There were two vacant properties in my block of flats. The whole block of flats is owned by the same person, the same property management company. Um, they were both vacant. They've both now been filled. Thoughts on second homeowners? For me, in a perfect world, if I won the lottery tomorrow, I would invest in property. I would. The fact that banks have now pulled mortgages for first-time buyers means if I was a lottery winner, I'm paying in cash. I'm buying outright. I'm not owing anything to a bank or a mortgage company. That would be what I would do if I became a multi-millionaire. Um, I would buy outright. But the thing is, I've got nothing against people because what load of loony lefties want is to basically ban second home ownership or really punish um, landlords. You do that, you take all the rental properties off the market, which leads to a further housing shortage. The majority of landlords are good. And my landlord, I would say, is average. There are things that my landlord could do better. However, my previous landlord was an utter cowboy. My thoughts on vacant properties. Now, the two flats that were vacant were both the leases were one of the tenants was evicted, and the other one, his lease ran out and he chose not to renew, and he moved to a bigger property because he has obviously dual custody for his son, and his son's getting older, and therefore a one bed studio flat is not great. So he decided to upsize. He's got a good paying job. He just at the moment is in the process of renting rather than owning his house. Um, Now his flat was completely refurbed. The landlord tidied it up, put new appliances in. If the tenants wanted it furnished or unfurnished, they completely tidied the flat up, redecorated it, completely refurbished it. New tenant moves in, and she keeps herself to herself. She seems friendly, but she moved in pretty quickly. The other flat where the person was evicted was vacant for about 3.5 months. There was a lot of repairs that needed facilitating to the apartment. The previous tenant had left it in a very sorry state. And I fell out with the previous tenant. I actually got on with him when I first moved in, but as time went on, he was becoming more of a pain in the arse. He didn't report a leak that trashed my other neighbour's flat, caused all the power to go out of the building. And he was growing cannabis. Now I can talk about drug legalization and drug use later on, because that is something that I believe quite strongly in, and regulating and legalizing it and taxing it, which could fill a tax black hole that we have. Which is why I vote Liberal Democrat is where I sit politically. So I'm centrist, really. Centrist, slightly centre left, slightly centre right, but basically in the middle, because the two main parties are so extreme, it's ridiculous. And don't get me started on populism, which and the identity politics in which they're playing, um, and it's quite divisive. Um, yeah, I had I've had where I currently live. Is my flat perfect? No, it still needs my back door fixing. I have started to get aggy with them. And a couple of my electrical outlets don't work, as in my plug sockets, because they were disconnected long ago under the previous management team. We don't know where the cable runs, and in order for them to rewire half my electrics, I have to vacate the flats for a lengthy spell of time because the builders are going to have to come in. The building is a bit rickety. It does have some issues. However, there is no damp, there is no mould. Um, Even without the heating on at the moment, it's quite warm. Partly because I've double glazed. Um, there are a few little niggles, but it's nowhere near as bad as the flat that I had before. Yes, it could be a lot better, but for what I'm paying, if I was living in the town centre where I live, I'm paying twice as much without bills included. So I've got bills included, which is kind of handy. My actual rent is really low. My council tax is, I think, higher than it should be. But that's about between me and the local authority that I will be taking up when obviously I get my letter in April for my next batch of council tax, because I think I'm being overcharged by a significant amount. Um, so there we go. In regards to you having a bad experience, yes, I've had a bad experience as well. My old block of flats was a converted Edwardian townhouse, which was kind of a big building, but it linked onto an Edwardian terrace behind. And we had a sinkhole forming in the car park. We had an abandoned car in the car park. We had major leaks constantly for 6 months. And eventually, after I moved out, my bathroom fell into the flat below. I found out because a colleague I worked with, his partner's friend, lived in the flat below after the guy beneath me moved out originally. He moved out, then I moved out, and the other guy beneath. Basically, three of us moved out within the space of 2 weeks, just before the COVID pandemic locked everything down. There's a sinkhole near me right now because the sewers collapsed. About 3/4 of a mile up the road, outside of primary school. Um, we The water mains basically burst. They fixed that, but then because of the excess water that was now flowing into the drainage system because of the burst water main, the drainage failed. We've had a lot of heavy rain, and Thames Water sent down a truck to pump water through to unblock, the blockage, and it fell into the road collapsed, and the truck. There's a articulated tanker lorry currently sat in a massive sinkhole outside of school that's meant to obviously have students in tomorrow, so that's going to be really interesting. Um, Social housing, subsistence is an interesting one. Um, we've had drainage issues where I live, but the whole area has drainage problems where I live. Surprising, a lot of very expensive houses, but there's a lot of drainage issues. The internet's terrible. The internet connectivity is absolutely substandard where I live. Hence why I have my mobile dongle. That's my Vodafone mobile dongle, so I can take that anywhere. I cancelled my hardwired internet because, well, I I was on a fixed contract. I got my internet, my broadband with my last flat, and my last flat I was right by the green box, so actually I had great connectivity. When I lived in Buckinghamshire in Taplow, which is just by Maidenhead, so just on the River Thames, where I live now, I never plugged my old router in. I never changed, got the engineer out. The other week I cancelled it. I said, "Oh, well, you've been off contract now for a period of time." I said, "Yes," but it was tied to my mobile phone contract. But yeah, um, it was diabolical. Basically, the connectivity here would make dial-up internet of the 90s look like progress. So I use my mobile internet. I'm right by the mobile mast, to be fair, which is 500 meters down the road for Vodafone. So I'm kind of lucky there. Um, in regards to my property, I'm on a ground floor flat. So yes, if we were to have a bit of flash flooding, I'm in trouble. But thankfully, that hasn't quite happened yet, although I've had water get up to my back door because the drainage with the soil and actually the drainage going down to uh, the actual sewers is so bad. The drains around here, the drainage is chronic, and a lot of the old terraced housing and the old posh houses down the road behind, there's a lot of old plots that were laid out 120, 130 years ago. The drainage system is shocking, um, absolutely shocking around here in the area I live in. The building itself, yeah, it needs a lot of TLC, but it's not bad. For what I'm paying, it's all right. It's comfortable. I'm never cold. Um, I've got decent neighbours. They fixed a lot of the other issues that I've had. Um, I'm just one of those tenants that doesn't like the pest of the landlord. I like to be just like a quiet tenant, do my thing, and get on with stuff. In regards to where I stand politically, I am a Liberal Democrat voter, and there's a lot of things that I believe politically that we could do to improve social equality and taxation and legalisation and decriminalisation on certain things. I'm very, very passionate on addiction support, mental health support, legalisation of recreational drug use. The war on drugs has been won by drugs. It's not been won by the authorities. I was having a conversation last year when I had my motorcycle accident. Obviously, the police turn up because it's the road traffic and all that, and they sit me by the side. And I started talking to one of the police officers who was actually younger than me at the time. And I was talking to him, and I said, "Look, while we're waiting for the ambulance, which never turned up, by the way, um, we got into a conversation. I was like, okay, what's your view on the um, uh, on the government's drug policy? Because obviously you're going to be, you know, dealing with." Because I said, well, so I asked him, well, is this the end of your shift? Yeah. What did you have to do with? Oh, some drinking drug related incident in another town. And I said, what's your views on the government's drug policy? Because I'll give you mine. I just thought, well, it's going to pass the time. We're going to be here a while. It's distracting me from the pain. And he basically summed up, yeah, I agree with you. You've lost the war on drugs. It should be legalised. It should be regulated, and therefore it'd be actually easier to target criminals then, because ironically, they caught Al Capone for failure to file a correct tax form during the Prohibition era in America. It also generates a lot of tax revenue. If you look at Colorado and you look at those states that legalise cannabis, or Holland or Uruguay, where all drugs are legal now and regulated and legalised, drug addiction has dropped, crime has dropped significantly in certain locations. And I know that's a smaller sample size because of the population size, but it's very, very striking. And in countries like Portugal and Uruguay and states like Colorado, tax revenue's gone up, crime rates have gone down, and admissions to hospital and addiction centres have also dropped, and deaths have dropped as a result. So that's that one. Am I okay with other people who support other parties? Well, look, I was brought up in a Labour household, and I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the Labour Party policies. And then my grandmother, who I was living with at just before the 2019 election, voted for Boris Johnson, which I found utterly bizarre. But they could never support Jeremy Corbyn. Um, and she also voted for Brexit. She was the only member of our family to do so, which I found very, very surprising considering my granddad was actually the more racist and homophobic member of the family. But then again, my nan's actually outed herself as a racist and a homophobe as well, which another reason why I'm glad I no longer have a relationship with that part of my family. I'm focused on my mum and my brother. And actually, since I've cut that rather toxic element of the family out, I'm a much happier, healthier person. When it comes to um, I've got friends who support independence. I've got a friend who's a member of the Conservative Party. Um, I don't agree with that, but fair play to him. He's same age as me. He's been a member of the Conservative Party since he was at university, which is very interesting. So he's 5 months younger than me. I respect him for that, but I have to vehemently disagree with the direction the party he is a member of has taken us since 2016. In regards to the Labour Party, I cannot get on with the Labour. I've just watched a four-part documentary series on the Labour Party, and it makes very troubling viewing um, if you are a Labour voter, have been a Labour voter, and how that party is structured, organised, and how they deal with a lot of things. The Tories are bad because they are incompetent right now. The Labour Party is systematically playing off various groups against each other, but trying to portray it as, oh, it's the right wing media and then the right wing of the Conservative Party, for example, trying to smear Jeremy Corbyn or Keir Starmer or candidates when actually they're doing it to themselves. Okay, so you're pro legalised weed, other drugs like meth, cocaine, on the look, I've got several books on narcotic the history of narcotics actually, and it's one of them is actually to do with the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler and crystal meth. I mean, amphetamines. Well, look, if you've got like things like ADD or ADHD, you'll put on Ritalin, you'll put on Adderall, things like that that are meant to equivalate what like caffeine. Caffeine technically is a stimulant drug, and cocaine and speed basically do the same thing that Ritalin does on the brain, and there are similar side effects. Um, and so there are basically legal. It's legal speed. Um, for me, I have to drink Coke Zero. Uh, for me, I have to drink Coke Zero. I can't have caffeine and sugar, so I have to have decaffeinated tea now. Um, and I found out I had ADHD last year, but I decided not to go down the full route of getting medicated, fully, dosed up, and dealing with um, psychologists and all that because I'm in my 30s now. And I fear it would impact my ability to do my job and function day to day. But I also get decaf tea because it's actually cheaper than normal tea, by the way, by like a lot. So it's kind of nice. In regards to drug legalization and protections for sex workers and minority rights, um, I'm very progressive in that regard. I do not agree with some of the policies the two main parties put forward in that regard. Um, I do have concerns that under Keir Starmer, I mean, uh, we could go down a less severe but a similar direction the Conservative Party have taken. That's my opinion. Um, I'm centrist, and I'm on the fence in regards to Europe. Economically, having a trade partner, absolutely. Politically, the EU is a mess, and it has been. It's a flawed organisation which massively needs reform, and every entity that has tried to have a united Europe has failed. Obviously, the Roman Empire lasted the longest, but the Holy Roman Empire gave it a go. Napoleon gave it a go. Um, and hey, look, the various Austrian and German empires gave it a go. Um, we found that the Eastern Bloc and NATO split it. Anyone who has tried to say Grand Europe or Europa or whatever it is has all eventually catastrophically collapsed in on itself. Um, as a trade bloc, fantastic idea. As a political entity with a political currency in the euro, absolute economic and political madness. Yet people still, in certain countries, want to keep the euro and keep voting pro EU, like Greece. Greece is in absolute denial about the situation the EU has left them politically and economically over the last 25 years. Partly because their own government were completely corrupt, but mess. I wouldn't say historically is a capital C. It's a small c conservative is what you're looking for. Conservative in nature, slow change, but progressively slow, pragmatic change, I think is a good way to look. Not just England, but the UK in general, because there's certain bits of Scotland that are quite uh, slow moving and slow paced. Certain bits of Wales as well that are pragmatic change. I think is what I would suggest the UK traditionally is. Um, Although we've had moments in our history of very radical policies. Um, I would say the 40s to the 60s was our most radical political period, um, historically, uh, because we set up the NHS, British Rail, all the utilities were nationalised. And then after the mid 50s, they were chronically mismanaged by up till actually, ironically, the early 2000s, the last bits of British Rail were actually fully sold off by the Labour government. So even Labour has privatised stuff. So we had about 50 years of chronic mismanagement. Eventually, Royal Mail, I think, is the last, apart from the NHS, that's been sold off, and chronic mismanagement. The Conservatives are the most pragmatic party out there. However, since Theresa May was put in as Prime Minister, I'm going to say this: David Cameron's government between 2010 and 2016 was actually surprisingly pretty competent. That's what I'm going to say. Let me say what I'm going to say on this. The reason why he was undermined as Prime Minister and had to call that referendum, which no one wanted really, was there was a proportion of the hard right, not far right, hard, not centre right, but right wing of the Conservative Party that has always been a bit sceptical about the political side of the EU, not the trade side, the political side. Very similar with the Labour Party splitting between what we see with the Labour Party today and the SDLP, the Social Democratic Labour Party, which joined the Liberal Party in '88 to become the Lib Dems. Labour historically has also been split over um, the EU, and basically UKIP is an offshoot of the Conservative Party on more of the right, and the Social Democrats merged with the Liberal Party to become the Lib Dems was the pro-European side, ironically, of Labour, and so therefore the two main parties have both been historically divided on our position in the European Union, or what was the European Economic Community before 1992, and I think the turning point where there's actual change in the direction of this country with its relation with Europe is not the Maastricht Treaty in '92, but it's the Lisbon Treaty in 2007, where it was forced through national parliaments. Ireland was against that treaty as well. I studied it at college. I actually studied the Lisbon Treaty. We were wavering on it, and it was shoved through quite quickly. Blair was leaving office. Brown's coming in. They first thing Brown does is sign that, and then within 5 or 6 months, Northern Rock starts going wobbly tits up, and then we have the full blown financial crash, which has definitely tainted the outlook of people in this country in regards to their outlook to the system, politicians, big business, the European Union, central banks, the whole thing. I wouldn't say no one who's Jewish will vote for them. There is a very hard pro-Israeli Jewish lobby, and those who are Jews who are not anti the state of Israel, but anti-Israeli policy. You have to watch the documentary on Al Jazeera. Um, just let that sink in. Do I feel I've slowed down? A little bit. I would say I've had some health issues over the years. I've had some bad injuries, accidents, sporting injuries, road traffic injuries, um, which have also impacted my body. Um, so my body feels very. I mean, my knee's been playing up today for some reason. I haven't really been doing any strenuous activity for 2 days, but my left knee is just swelled up, which is nice. Um, but yeah, I think I'm definitely a little bit less energetic than what I was. Um, let's say when I first started the channel up, only 5 years ago, I started doing content. I obviously first actually started my YouTube channel to subscribe to content in 2014, but I only started doing content in 2017 on both channels. I felt more energetic 4 years ago than I do now. But in that time frame, when I first started doing content on both these channels, I was still recovering from my first major motorcycle accident with my shoulder. And then obviously last year I took a very lengthy spell, not doing any content because I was recovering from my last serious motorcycle accident. But yeah, I have definitely noticed that over time I have slowed a bit, and I'm less energetic, and I'm less vibrant. I think is a good way, yes. But it's just the aging process. People don't realise I'm nearly 33. They think I'm a lot younger than I actually am. I take that as a compliment. Um, People do think I'm actually younger than nearly 33. They think I'm like 27, 25, 27. So I take that as a compliment. But I haven't. In regards to the Manchester derby, I haven't actually put any thought into the Manchester derby and looking at it. Um, I can discuss that on the other channel. I may do some content on the other channel this evening. Um, I mean, obviously, there's some other big sporting events coming up. I mean, look, it's the first weekend back for football. It's a big derby match. Obviously, Arsenal winning yesterday is important. Beating Tottenham in the manner they did, dominant performance. Man City and Spurs. I mean, look, Man City get a draw, they drop points. Um, so we can look at the league table when we go into the World Cup break. I think would be a good time to assess not only what's going on right now, but that'd be a good time to assess where teams are at. And I think certain teams will be impacted more than others with losing players to the World Cup, where there could be injury or illness coming out of that tournament. It would be interesting if we look, the last non-Labour led or Conservative led government was the Liberal government in World War One, and obviously yes, we've had 2 periods of coalition government um, in the last 120 years. I do fear that if we had a general election called tomorrow, right? Let's say Liz Truss goes, well, snap election, we're going to have an election in 6 weeks' time, which is highly feasible. We would be in a position that we were in 2010, with a hung parliament where the Liberal Democrats and let's say possibly the nationalists in Wales and Scotland Plaid Cymru and the Scottish National Party could be holding the key to a coalition government or a government with supply and demand um, um, voting, and we may have a minority government. So, while we could all always dream on, let's say, the Lib Dems, for example, being in a position they were in, let's say, late 2009, early 2010 under Nick Clegg, which they blew, by the way, they blew that position. They could have refused to work in coalition with either major party and forced a second runoff general election. They chose to go into coalition with the wrong party, in my opinion. And I voted for Nick Clegg in 2010. I voted for the Lib Dems in 2010. They were the power brokers. I think they should have stuck to their guns and either gone with the Labour Party or forced a rerun vote. And I think possibly they may have polled even more seats and then had a bigger say on formation of any particular government. And on what we saw um, in the 30s and 40s in the build up to World War II and obviously during World War II was national government from the 20s, 30s, 40s, national government, where it was multiple parties working together. Um, we may see that again. Now, that could be very, very interesting. I think we're very politically divided right now. We shall see. What are my thoughts on more right-wing parties growing in Europe? Again, this is, I think, to do with the EU and their handling of several issues over the last decade and a half. There were concerns about the Lisbon Treaty when it was signed in 2007, as there were concerns back in 2004 with the expansion of the EU to Central and Eastern Europe. Only a handful of those countries, I think, should have been admitted because they met the economic levels that were required under the EU constitution, which even Greece wouldn't get in if we're properly enforcing the rules on economics and the state of the economy. You should never have got in, but they did. And what we've seen over the last 18 years is we have seen a skill shortage in this country. And of course, Poland joins, you know, the former, communist countries of Central and Eastern Europe join en masse in 2004. And then in 2000, I think it was 2007, I think it was, Bulgaria and Romania joined, but there was restrictions on the amount of um, uh, visa applications you could get for a period of time. We had a skills shortage in Western Europe, and what we've seen is a brain drain from the East going to the West. And now those Central and Eastern European countries are having to import labour from places like Ukraine and Belarus and the Balkans to fill their brain drain they've had come further west and north. And then we see that the migrant crisis coming out of the Middle East and Africa over many years. This is not something that's happened overnight. And when Angela Merkel said, "Oh, we'll open the floodgates," that was basically Germany running roughshod over the rest of the EU. And all these migrants, be it economic or actual refugees, have gone through many safe countries to get to Germany, to get to Scandinavia, and to get here. And governments like France deliberately put red tape and do nothing. It's a fact. The French deliberately, the camp, from the day that they started building the Channel Tunnel to the day it opened, camps were formed of refugees to get to the UK, Ireland, and Scandinavia. And all along the Channel coast, from every Channel port, from Denmark all the way down to Britain, there is massive problems with people being trafficked the further north and west. And this leads to a fueling of resentment, and populist politicians and rather aggressive extremists, both right and left wing groups, feed upon this frustration where you've got cheap labour coming into the labour market. You have areas of deprivation like East Germany around Dresden, nowhere near the same economic development, let's say, as Stuttgart, for example, the north of England, where former industries have been wound down, unemployment's higher than the national average, crime rates are higher than the national average, and you've got lots of low skilled, cheap labour being implanted when you've got skilled workers out of work who are frustrated. Then you have massive inequality in vast areas. And in France, there's a lot of deprivation in some big cities like Marseille and Paris and Lyon. There's some what the French government actually officially describes as ghettos and no-go areas. And we've seen like riots in France, riots here, um, riots in Greece, Italy. We've actually seen like angry youth or areas of deprivation, angry protests, angry riots. It's 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 been brewing for some time. The financial crisis exacerbated feeling against the system, where the mainstream politicians and institutions, a lot of people felt we were failed. And we were repeating what happened in the 20s and 30s following the First World War. We are repeating what happened a century ago with the rise of fascism and Nazism and communism in the 20s and 30s and all the bloodshed that went with that. Do I think the UK splitting would be bad? It will create more social division. Every Scotsman, Welshman, and Irishman, and I will include Southern Irish that live here. There's a reason why they've come to these locations. Um, it would just create more division, and the Scottish economy would be absolutely on its knees very very quickly. Considering we've got to move away from fossil fuels, their economy is so dependent on fossil fuels. Um, Manufacturing in Scotland's basically at zero, so that would be suicide. Wales, the rural areas of Wales would be real trouble. Um, there's already great deprivation in large parts of Wales, and they haven't. Yeah, no, it wouldn't work. It would be carnage. And most of the Welsh, the big urban areas, vote Labour. They want to stay, or vote Lib Dem. They want to stay. They vote for unionist parties. It's only in Anglesey, really rural areas of northwest Wales, that vote for Plaid Cymru. In reality, that's still a minority of the vote in those constituencies and councils. It's just the first past the post system. It won't happen. Could Wales take some land back? Look, there's always there's always local authority changes and changes to authority boundaries. We've seen like Berkshire, where I live, for example, was a formal county council until 1998. It was split into 6 districts. They're now 6 boroughs. And there were county line changes made in the 70s. So we gained Slough, but we lost half of the county to Oxfordshire. So they've made administrative changes. It happens quite regularly. Well, the cost of I'm not going to talk about people in Chester very anti-Welsh as historical. There's a lot of that's sort of a bit surprising, really, considering a lot of people commute into Chester from Wales for work. Will the cost of living get better? We shall see. We shall see. Technically, the UK is not officially in recession because apparently the Office of National Statistics have got that one wrong again. So this is where I have a lot of dubious feelings about some of the stats we've been thrown at, how they calculate inflation, how this is calculated. So yeah, I'm a bit dubious and a bit suspect with they constantly revise the stats in regards to economic output that we've seen over the last 2.5 years. Yes, there was definitely a complete shutdown of the economy for a minimum of 6 weeks. The lockdowns, like Christmas 2020, didn't help. Obviously, not having lockdowns from March last year until now has obviously boosted the economy a little bit. But there is definitely issues with how they're compiling the inflation stats, KPI, and all that inflation, and also how they're working out how the economy hasn't contracted, um, which is interesting. Um, I don't think Scotland can do well on its own because it is so heavily reliant on the oil and gas industry and alcohol distillery, so whiskey basically. Yes, they do get a lot of tourists, but a lot of the shipyards are far smaller than what they used to be. Obviously, Aberdeen's also famous for being called the Granite City, so a lot of mineral extraction is a lot less than what it used to be. Um, there is high depth. Glasgow is rife with deprivation, um, and there is a lot of issues that I don't think people really actually realise about the Scottish economy. It's not as diverse as other areas in the UK. If you're looking at what the EU was saying about deprived areas, Glasgow is one of the most deprived areas. Glasgow is apparently more deprived than all of Ukraine up to 2014 as a city as a whole. There are areas of Glasgow where the average life expectancy is 40. Yeah, when your biggest urban area has that disparity in in wealth and high unemployment, a low life expectancy than the average by a lot, massive drug and crime problems, and a very hopeless devolved government. The SNP are not doing a good job in Scotland. Um, Trust me, they there's not a lot of political discourse in Scotland either. It's left wing or left of centre or left wing, and there's a lot of dodginess going on in Scotland, as well as sectarianism in Scottish politics and society that people don't realise, and there's huge problems with drug problems, drug deaths, drug crime. Um, Scotland's got a lot of what it is. Greta Thunberg. She's been surprisingly quiet since the war in Ukraine kicked off. Um, um, Look, I mean, obviously they're trying to force these electric cars on us, but what is very, very interesting is they have to get lithium out the ground. Now, lithium is an exceptionally toxic metal, and the batteries are exceptionally, they're almost impossible to recycle. Lithium batteries, almost impossible. And you can run an old Chevy Camaro from '68 until now, and it'd be less polluting than actually building a Tesla. Let that sink in. And you look at mineral extraction. There's one university that says we're no longer going to provide uh, connections with um, the, the fossil fuel industry or mining. Mineral extraction is hugely important. How do you think you get iron ore to make steel? How do you think you get aluminium to make aircraft and cars? Like some of these brain dead, loony lefty um, eco mentalists. There are ways to go carbon neutral. There are ways to get renewable and nuclear energy to work. There are. And this is another thing that Germany's done wrong is following Fukushima with that earthquake in 2011 in Japan and the tsunami and the Fukushima meltdown. Germany stupidly turned off all their nuclear power plants, which has contributed to Putin realizing he can hold Europe hostage by his war in Ukraine. Well done, Merkel. Merkel's done a few things that have actually backfired, not only for Germany, but Europe as a whole. Her immigration policy was flawed. I do believe that immigration is a good thing. Technically, I was actually born in Germany. Um, I've lived abroad. I was born abroad. Um, my aunt's Japanese. She's an immigrant. My cousin's a mixed race. We need to have the right immigration in the sense of skilled immigrants coming to the country, not unskilled labour. We're talking about skilled labour. We're talking about people coming from all over the world, regardless of are they EU or non-EU, doesn't matter. But unfortunately, talking about a points-based system, and it's racist. No, it's not. Australia has a points-based system, and their economy is far healthier than ours. New Zealand has a points-based system. Their economy structurally is in a lot better shape than ours. America, Canada, all have points-based systems and visa systems. Their inflation rate is lower, and their economies are growing faster than ours. Let that sink in. The net zero argument. I mean, Labour at their conference published a plan to be set up a publicly owned energy company that aims to provide net zero green and nuclear energy solely by 2030, which is not going to happen because the left wing like to come up with promises they can't keep. The right wing just make up words as they go along and bumble their way through. Um, I, look, I what has happened though is we have sold off our energy infrastructure to foreign companies. EDF is French. You know, and they're meant to be building nuclear power stations for us, but they're French. So we've sold off a lot of our national infrastructure to global. It's called globalization, and that's another thing people have been very, very angry about for the last 15, 20 years. Do I agree with all liberal policies? No. You don't have to. I I do think they got their tuition fees wrong in 2010. Badly wrong. I think and they called that AV referendum. That's the other. That's one of the two times I haven't voted was the AV voting referendum in 2011. I thought that was pointless. It was the wrong time for it. I think if we were to have that referendum now, it'd be a different result. But I don't agree with how they promised not to raise tuition fees and scrap EMA and ALG. They promised to protect those educational safeguards which were in place when I was a student, when I was a first-time Liberal Democrat voter, when I voted in 2010. And they went and then they decided to back cuts to the education budget in 2010. Now, what is interesting is in 2010, I don't know if you guys voted or even if you were eligible to vote at the time because of age or how old you guys were, but all three major political parties that were standing to basically form a government, of which two did, all of them said they would have cuts to public expenditure. And we have to accept that. That is fact. What is interesting is the Labour Party cuts would actually still be continuing now. From what there was in their manifesto in 2010. The Liberal Democrat cuts, I think, would have been done with tax adjustments. They were less clear in their manifesto, but they were also looking at possibly a currency change or changing the role of the Bank of England in regards to interest rate policy, and they were considering looking at adopting the euro or refloating the currency. I believe. Although their cuts would have been slightly less and also in severity per department and also spread out over a longer period of time. They were also considering if they'd want a majority reducing the voting age to 16 and actually bringing in a change to the alternative vote proposal instead of calling a pointless referendum, actually looking at changing how we elect our representatives with the AV system, which is actually quite interesting, which would have actually severely weakened all the major political parties and actually made it a bit more of an even spread in Parliament with more coalition government, which is not necessarily more stable government. But what is interesting is all the major parties were determined to make a similar amount of savings in cuts over different periods of time. And what is interesting is I think the Labour cuts would have lasted until about now. The Lib Dem cuts or reduces in expenditure forecasted would have not that no one could forecast that we were going to have a plague of international proportions in 2020. But with what they were forecasting at the time, we couldn't predict that you're going to have the Arab Spring, like the war in Libya, the war in Syria, the wave of illegal immigration and human trafficking across the Mediterranean and across Eastern Europe that we've had. No one could predict that Donald Trump was going to become president Obama was still in charge. So what a lot of what's happened in the last decade was unknown. But they were going off trajectories and things like that. But one thing that did happen was if I was to with what the Conservative government and the Chancellor have just done is they reduced the upper 50% rate to 45%, and they've reversed that national insurance rise. Now that national insurance rise does benefit me, and that does benefit my back pocket. However, the weakening of the currency doesn't. Fine. What is interesting though is if I was actually coming up with a tax cut, the only tax I would have cut is VAT. Like what they did in 2007, 2008, I would cut VAT. That would be my tax cut because VAT when it was brought in back in the 70s was only be a 10 or early 80s under Thatcher or something. Or it was either the 70s under Ted Heath or Thatcher. I can't remember. It was a Conservative government that brought VAT. It was meant to be a temporary measure to plug a financial hole that the government had at the time. It was before the winter of discontent. I know it was in the 70s VAT was introduced. It would be a temporary tax that was meant to be removed within a couple of years. It stayed for 40. I would cut VAT to record low levels. For many years, it was 17.5% as a sales tax. It was cut to 15% by the Labour government under Gordon Brown as a temporary measure, and then it was put up to 20%. What I would do is I would cut it to 10, between 5 and 10%. I would drastically reduce VAT, which would then mean when you do go out to buy your food, to buy your fuel, to pay for your energy, and it also helps businesses as well because that is a tax that businesses hate. If you're a small or medium-sized business and you want to purchase supplies from another business, you've got to pay VAT because that's a purchase. If and then you have to also pass that on to your customers as well. At which point the customer has to pay VAT plus that as well. Do I think politicians have any respect from people? No. Well, look what's happened over the last few years. I didn't agree with a lot of what Theresa May did. Calling that snap election when she did was stupid. They had a majority, working majority, and she lost it. But then she was completely undermined by her backbenchers and the media. And when Boris Johnson obviously uh, and announced his resignation and he was standing down for September when they had the leadership on, she was the only Conservative MP that refused to stand and clap him because he's not a Brexiteer. Ironically, he voted to remain. He literally is an opportunist. He's not even a pragmatist. He's an opportunist. He swerves his way. So let that sink in. You've still got to pay other duties on fuel. VAT only makes a proportion of what you pay at the petrol station. But no, I don't think a lot of politicians have a lot of respect. There are a few that I think do you actually can understand because they've not been career politicians. Alan Johnson was a famous, used to be a postie, which is very, very interesting. And I had a lot of time for Alan Johnson, even though he was a Labour politician, and even Paul Tillot, because they also could have a conversation with them, disagree with them inherently on a lot of policies that they both stood for, but you could have a conversation with them. And I feel you can't have that with a lot of the current lot. Thoughts on the monarchy? Stabilising force. Every country that's got a monarchy generally actually has pretty stable government in Europe. Those that have got rid of their monarchies, ironically, have been less stable with a lot more political instability since removing said monarchy from their political system. Now, we have a constitutional monarchy. The monarchy is just a figurative head of state, much like the Italian president really doesn't do much. Just take monarch out, put president in. Same with France, remove monarch, put president in. It's basically what it is. Except France is a very weird democracy. It's a presidential parliamentary democracy, very weird. The president has a lot of power, so does the parliament as well. Whereas in Italy, another presidential democracy, the parliament has the power. The president is literally limited power figurehead, very similar to here. Still a little bit more power. That's basically it. Germany, president and chancellor. So, figuratively speaking, France is the most like a the the Restoration Bourbon monarchy of the 1820s today, um, called the Orleanist monarchy, um, because they had three revolutions in France. They got rid of three monarchies in France. They replace. They have the French Revolution, then they have the Revolution of 1830, and then they have Louis Philippe. He gets kicked out, and then you have Napoleon Bonaparte III, president, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte I, who then becomes emperor of the French and then loses the Franco-Prussian War. Yeah, France is weird. They like rioting a lot in France, and very unstable governments in France. A lot of political instability in France for a very, very long time. A lot of riots. They like rioting. They like striking and rioting in France. Yeah, well, look, I personally would cut VAT. That would be the only tax cut I would make. It helps small to medium-sized businesses. It helps the consumer, and it helps the poorest in society because that's a tax that no one can avoid. Although some businesses try and fiddle their VAT receipts, the actual average person, it relieves a burden on their bills. Also, some countries like Belgium, Monaco, without the monarchies, yeah, pretty much Belgium would be chaos. Half of Belgium would be French, half of it would be Dutch, and bits of it don't want to be French, bits of it don't want to be. That's a very divided society. Um, very divided society, and their monarchy is German. Um, Monaco is very, very interesting. Like Liechtenstein, the monarch actually has very powerful powers politically. Um, Liechtenstein's another one, which is very, very interesting because it's a very small country. It's an absolute monarchy. Um, Although they have weakened the principalities' power in the House of Liechtenstein. You have to study some of these other nations because we get so focused on our own mess that we fail to realise we do have to have these relationships with other countries, and we fail to understand their political systems are completely different to us. Completely. Um, Luxembourg has some of the highest wages. Switzerland and Norway are far more expensive to live than Luxembourg. Luxembourg's actually cheaper to live in Switzerland than Norway. Um, but it is expensive, yes, because it's a small nation with limited real estate, basically. Um, it's a beautiful little country. I've been there. People go, "Oh, it's really boring." No, it's not. It's a very historical, beautiful part of the world. It's in the Ardennes. A lot of history with Luxembourg. Um, they have high average salaries, high standard of living. There are parts of Luxembourg that are actually very, very cheap. In the rural areas, you can buy a very, very cheap property because you're out of the way. But the towns and cities, I suppose, they're very condensed, lack of space, much like a lot of European cities, and it is kind of expensive. But Switzerland and Norway are far more expensive to live um, than, and they've got very, and especially in Switzerland, very, very strict planning laws as well, which make it very, very difficult to apply to build stuff. We've got very, very strict laws in Switzerland. Some of the cantons, which is counties to us, in Switzerland, there's a lot of things you can't do the washing on a Sunday. You can't wash your car, mow your lawn. If you live in a block of flats like me, you can't take a shit after 10 p.m. In Luxembourg, Luxembourgish is the official language, although French, German, and Flemish are also recognised, but it's Luxembourgish, which is a Germanic language, but it's not quite German and it's not quite Flemish. It's sort of, I wouldn't say like Afrikaans, but it's of that kind of group of languages. It's a Germanic language, but it's its own separate language, and they're very, very fiercely anti-German. Ironically, when it comes to their language, they're like, no, we're not German. And that stems from both world wars where they were occupied, and a lot of Americans thought that Luxembourg, they there's a lot of foreign nationals live in Luxembourg for work. It's got a lot of EU offices and a lot of multinational offices, um, and there's a lot of people who speak other languages at home. English is also quite widely spoken as well. Switzerland is a weird one. Switzerland is four official languages. You've got German, French, Italian, and Romansh. And the German, French, and Italian are actually are Swiss German, Swiss French, Swiss Italian, and Romansh is just what I call drunk Germanic Italian, really. Um, really, you have to be drunk to understand it. It's a lovely language. Though. Some of their writing and their calligraphy is brilliant, but you have to be. It's basically what I call. It's a weird language. It's the second closest language to what they call Vulgar Latin, which is just slang Latin that you would hear in the old Roman times. Um, Switzerland's got four parts. Switzerland is German, French, Italian, and Romansh, which is just basically the Far East is just Switzerland is weird. Just now you've got Italian bits as well, and the Romansh bit is very very. It's almost like the Lombard Italian dialect. So they're not quite. It's weird. Switzerland is broken into four bits, and they've got four official languages. It's very simple. It's the reason why they speak the languages. Romansh is just the eastern canton of Grisons or Graubünden, which is what they call the Grey League, where there was a wars of religion. It's really complicated, and I know a lot about it because I've actually lived in a bit of Italy just south of which was actually the Valtellina, which is once part of the Grey Leagues. It was war between Protestants and Catholics, and Holy Roman Empire, and some Protestant nobles, and the Duchy of Milan. There's lots of killing, um, and that's why the Romansh there. It's a very isolated, rural, mountainous part of Switzerland, where there isn't. It's a very sparse population. And then you have the German bit like Zurich and Basel, or Basel, depending on how you pronounce it, and Lausanne and Saint Gallen in the north central, and then the French bits like Geneva and Lausanne by Lake Geneva, and the Italian bit is Ticino and Lugano and by near Lake Garda. And historically, those bits of Switzerland were owned by the Holy Roman Empire for a bit, the French Kingdom of France, the Duchy of Burgundy, which is the French bit, and the Italian bit was Piedmont and what Kingdom of Sardinia and all that. So therefore, historically, these areas were owned by other countries for a bit until 1815. Um, Austrian German is different because they basically call it country bumpkin. Österreich is how you say Austrian German. The Austrian German dialect is very very different to what you. So if you're in Vienna and you've got official documents, they speak German. But if you go out into the Nord Tyrol, which is the bit of just north of Italy, and the Südtirol used to be part of where Bolzano, or Bozen, which is the German way of saying it, which used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the First World War. The Austrian German they speak is different. It's like the West Country accent here. It's slightly slower and a bit less angry. Austria is a weird place because you've got a big Hungarian population still there. And there's a lot of Slavic sounding surnames and place names. And so when you look at the Austrian national side, you'll see a lot of what sound like Balkan, like Croatian, and there is still that influence from the former. Oh, Arnautovic is one. Vlasic is another one. Very Slovenian, Croatian sounding surnames. And that's to do with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the splitting up of nationalities and Treaty of Versailles and all the other treaties that went subsequent to World War One and the formations of the Czechoslovakia and the splitting of Austria-Hungary and then the Anschluss population. The dual monarchy. You can blame the revolutions of 1848 for that. We could be here for some time. You can blame the fall of the weakening of the Austrian Empire and the rise of the Prussian German Empire and the revolutions of 1848 and then German unification over the subsequent years and the wars of Italian unification for what became Austria-Hungary and then the dual monarchy. and half of the empire being administered out of Vienna and the other half out of Budapest. So you had two separate parliaments and bit of a mess, really. Isn't there a part of Italy and Germany and Switzerland? Yes, there's a little part of Germany near Zurich, and there's a little part of Italy near Lugano, which is technically an enclave. There are some little enclaves inside Switzerland that belong to other countries, and that is again going back to the Holy Roman Empire and the early days of Piedmont, Sardinia, which is became the ruling house of the Kingdom of Italy after basically the collapse of Napoleon's empire and the reformation of the Treaty of Vienna in 1814, and then the Hundred Days, Waterloo, that kind of period. But yes, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Austria, back to what they speak. Their dialect of German is not what you would hear in Berlin or Munich. Munich is obviously in Bavaria. Stuttgart is Württemberg. I was born in Münster. And I live in Osnabrück, which is Rhine-Westphalia, Rhineland-Westphalia. Nord Rhine-Westphalia actually is technically where it is now. So that's where I used to live. Then you've got Hamburg, which is Schleswig-Holstein, which used to be part of Denmark, parts of it. There's a bit of a Danish influence in the language. Austria is really weird. It's sort of like Bavarian and Saxon German dialects, but it isn't, because it's Styrian German, which is what Austria used to be, the Duchy of Styria, medieval stuff. Wasn't Galicia part of Portugal? No, it never has been. That bit of Portugal and that bit of Spain, no, that's never been a thing. Portugal was actually once part of Spain for about 80 years. It was occupied by Spain, and so the Portuguese don't like the Spanish. And the Spanish, some people in Spain see Portugal as a escaped Spanish province. So there's a bit of rivalry there. The Iberians don't like each other. Interesting. It's the most interesting continent. Africa's pretty interesting as well because we just drew lines. So Libya, someone just went, I'm going to draw a line there and a line there and some twiddly bits here with Morocco and Algeria and all that. Yeah. Egypt, we'll draw a line there and a line there and we'll nick a bit of Sudan. And we'll have the Sinai and do that. Oh, yes. Let's do Mauritania. So some line. North Africa's. Oh, God, yes. You've got Guinea. You've got Guinea-Bissau. It's quite. There is a definite divide in East and West Germany. So I was born in West Germany because it was Equatorial Guinea. That's the one. Yes, I was born in West Germany as it was at the time in 1989. So the Berlin Wall had officially been breached. The Iron Curtain hadn't come down. Unification was taking place over 1990 and 1991. Then the East German state just ceases to exist. So basically, the West German state is now the German state. The flag stays the same. The currency stayed the same. And Dresden was the biggest city in East Germany, which is Saxony. And then places in East Germany are so the imbalance, massive imbalance, and that's where the far right, the alternative for Deutschland, the ALD, is quite popular in Dresden and Saxony. In that part of what was West Prussia, before World War One, quite bad. The Central African Republic, yes, the one of the most backward and divided countries where it's politically unstable and they've got militias running around and warlords running around. Yes, the CAR, Central African Republic. Yeah, not really. Well, nothing positive comes out of there apart from poverty, warlords, and corruption. But that's Africa for you. Yes, Botswana is very, very nice. It's one of the success stories to come out of Africa post-colonialism. So ironically, a very stable country, and it's one of those countries that doesn't get the recognition of being actually pretty decent of the African nations, like Namibia and Zambia, quite peaceful. And then you've got Zimbabwe to ruin it all. And that's just a blot on the copybook that in Robert Mugabe caused. But but Botswana is it was been on a Top Gear special, the Botswana special, when they go across the Makati Kati, and that's why I don't think I'm the Kim. That's why I don't think the Kim dynasty fell. I think Korea should unite right away to cripple the South economy. The German economy had to deal with a higher inflation and unemployment for a long time, and the East is still underdeveloped, and there is a great wealth disparity. They are trying to relocate a lot of manufacturing plants and investment into the East. It's taken 30 years, and there's still. It's like parts of like northern England and the Midlands have been left behind over the last 30, 40 years. It's just what these Germans like. You know, and I've got a friend. I've got a few friends from Zimbabwe. Let's not talk positive about Robert Mugabe. He was Africa's Hitler. He was the successful version of Idi Amin because he managed to stay in power until the day he basically snuffed it. Robert Mugabe. That's the complete Idi. I mean, to be honest, if North Korea collapsed, which I think it will do um, at some point, I don't think it will cripple South Korea. Um, I think South Korea definitely has the advancement in technology and infrastructure to uh, assist North Korea into working. But the Balkans mess. I've been to the Balkans, lovely part of the world, crazy people. The Balkans has been a nightmare since the Ottoman Empire basically collapsed in the build up to the First World War and after the First World War. Absolute nightmare. You had the two Balkan wars build up to the First World War between 1912 and 1913. Um, you had the annexation of Bosnia, the Croatians and the Slovenes are different to the Bosniaks and Serbs, the Montenegrins, the Macedonians, and the Kosovans. Um, that's basically where Novi Sad is. Novi Sad's the second biggest city in Serbia after Belgrade. It's the northern region of Serbia that is bordering parts of Croatia, not too far from Zagreb. Um, it won't happen. It just won't. It's not too far from Vukovar, basically, where the water tower had all the bullet holes put through it and shell holes. I've been to Croatia. I've been to Slovenia. Um, I wasn't too far away from Bosnia, um, but I was close enough. And yes, there was still um, quite recent evidence of obviously the Yugoslav wars in the 90s, and even obviously what happened in World War Two as well. You could still see battle evidence from the 40s and the 90s in some of the buildings and some of the ruins in Slovenia and Croatia. It was there. You could see it. And there were still bits and pieces left over from the First World War between Italy and Austria-Hungary, the old front lines in Slovenia. I went over them, drive over the old front lines um, for the battles of the Isonzo and the Battle of the Piave River and Battle of Caporetto, the Tragento Adige went through the front lines there, where there was a massive battle in like 1915, 1916. So I've literally, where the Italian front line with the Austro-Hungarian Empire was in World War One, I've driven, actually been through areas that were battled, where the front lines actually were. Um, and it leaves an impression on you. You can actually see the trench lines in the fields near Venice. You can actually see them off the motorway. You can see where they've got the risotto rice fields. They're not quite rice paddies, but because risotto rice is different to rice you get from India and China and Thailand and such. But you can see where they have the drainage ditches, and then you can see the zigzags, actually the crop marks where the old front lines used to be. Um, in 1917, 1918. It sticks with you. And then when you get into Slovenia, you can see you cross over the border near Trieste, and you get into Slovenia, and the Isonzo River and Gorzia. Um, you see it, and then you see the military roads that were cut through by the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then you see um, basically where the Italians and the Germans, basically with the occupying forces of Yugoslavia, Italians, the Germans, and the Bulgarians. You can see, where they've executed partisans. You can see there's plaques and memorials where like partisan band was captured or uh, whatever. And then there'll be a monument of the partisans defeated an Italian detachment. And it's weird. And then you see what happened in between 91 and 95, and it just makes you think this happened in my lifetime. And I've seen there's a wall in a village. Forget where it is. It's in central Croatia, and you can see the pot marks from the machine guns. And there's a big plaque on the wall. It's in many languages. It's in German. It's in English. It's in Italian. It's in Croatian. It's in Cyrillic for the Serbian and Montenegrin people. And you can see where whatever force came along, just ran with all the men that were left in the village that weren't under arms and shot them. Texas, Scotland, Basque, Catalonia, and Quebec. Texas is the only state in the US Union that has the right to secede from the Union. Won't happen. Scotland, I don't think it happens. I think the SNP patience is starting to run thin with Willie Cranky, Sturgeon. Catalonia, the EU won't accept it because then it weakens and then causes other member states to have problems. Won't happen. Won't happen with the and Quebec. It's mostly the older generation. The younger French Canadians are more relaxed in regards to their relationship with the rest of Canada. And if it was a full Canadian referendum, I think Alberta is more likely to become an independent state than Quebec, quite frankly. And it doesn't work economically because they will be very, very economically isolated. Because then other parts of Canada can control the St. Lawrence waterway on the way out, which would be like Newfoundland and Labrador and Ontario, and they can just shut off the Quebec economy if they want. Same with Alberta. Alberta has more political bargaining power because that's where obviously the Alberta oil fields are. Do I think smaller countries work better? Not necessarily. Not necessarily, not from what I've seen. That's an interesting one. I wouldn't say necessarily yes. I can't agree or disagree on that. Ireland's worked pretty well. Ireland's pretty chronic because they've got basically a rotating prime minister with the government in power. They rotate the prime ministership every 2 years. So I wouldn't say a smaller country necessarily works better. Belgium, you've got 2 parliaments because of the Flems and the Walloons. Holland went without a government for 6 months. I don't necessarily think that smaller nations necessarily work better than bigger. It's just how you deal with the levels of bureaucracy required in order to get through that. But the Balkans is a right shit show. I've seen photos of Bosnia and the damage caused. The Sarajevo Olympic, well, not just the bobsleigh run, but the entire Olympic village is gone. Bosnia is still a potential flare up. So is Kosovo. The fact that Kosovo still is not recognised by the UN the UN has a bad reputation in the Balkans with their failure at Srebrenica and other issues to do with the collapse of the Yugoslav Republic. And notice they're not overly getting involved in Ukraine. The UN really did fail miserably in regards to what happens in the 90s in Yugoslavia, massively. At first, they tried to declare Croatia and Slovenia's independence as illegal for the first couple of years before recognising them. Absolute shambles. But there's a potential for a further flare-up in the Balkans at some point. Next new sovereign state, possibly Puerto Rico. I think I can see Puerto Rico either asking for admittance to the US fully, or it becomes a separate nation. I think Puerto Rico is more likely than the Basque Country or Catalonia or Scotland. I think Puerto Rico is more likely to want to succeed. Maybe some of the Dutch and British colonies and the French colonies in the Caribbean as well, possibly. If they do that, I can't see them nuking a non-nuclear power. Um, and from what we've seen with their technology, a lot of their I wouldn't be surprised if it leaks fuel on the launch pad and blows up actually on the launch pad. We've seen the Russian equipment be substandard and subpar, and only a very few units actually have equipment that fully works. So, yeah, I don't know. Their forces seem poorly motivated, and look at the amount of people trying to escape cooler, fleeing to the border. Kazakhstan, Georgia, Finland have all seen record numbers of applications for asylum or tourist visas that will deliberately be broken by people who do not want to go back. Um, if they go the nuclear option, then yeah, that's one way to not get the Ukrainian people on side because they want to take over the whole of Ukraine. That's one way to have a resistance for generations. Um, this is a mess, absolute mess. Um, the situation is quite serious. I think Belarus that there could be an overthrow of the government in Belarus. Lukashenko is not overly popular in Belarus. He's trying to cling to power, and there is passive resistance to the Russian military moving through Belarus. So, yeah, they do risk. They. I'm not sure how China and North Korea would feel about that because that then could exacerbate a conflict that China is very reliant on us buying their crap, their cheap crap, basically. And there is a concern because of the invasion of Ukraine. China, its biggest independent trade partner, ironically, is Ukraine. Um, they're Kyrgyzstan. There was a bit of protesting a while ago, and the government shot a few people. There's the occasional attempted revolution, and the army tends to shoot people quite a bit. Human rights, not a thing over there, but they have lots of natural gas, which is something that the rest of the world wants right now. The Russians aren't giving anyone. So, a lot of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia are right now, ironically, key political players. They can be because they're on trade. They're on the old Silk Road. They're on natural gas routes, pipelines, oil pipelines, lots of resource-rich areas. No is the answer. They don't. Human rights in Central Asia. What is that? Mongolia's probably got more human rights than the former Soviet republics and China put together. Mongolia is probably a better place to live than Kazakhstan. Um, or Uzbekistan. Their human rights record is just as appalling as Belarus and Russia. It's the former Soviet republics, the only ones that actually have a decent record human rights wise are Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Even Ukraine's got massive um, um, Ukraine has had some bad human rights abuses as well. Before the Maidan revolution of 2014, there was lots of not so nice things happening in Ukraine as well. Um, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia and Azerbaijan are basically in a state of war. I think Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are again virtually in a state of war as well. So some of the ex-Soviet republics are also not particularly fond of each other, let alone former motherland. There was internal conflict in the Soviet Union while they were fighting in Afghanistan. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan has been going since 1988. They've not been particularly fond of each other, and that's over various political and geographical disputes over territory. Um, yeah, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they are quite small. But guess what? They have a lot of shale oil and gas, and also Lithuania and Poland surround Kaliningrad, which used to be Königsberg, which basically was East Prussia. So there's a Russian enclave surrounded by EU and NATO countries, which is a problem. And that's where part of the Baltic Fleet is stationed in Kaliningrad in Eastern Europe, formerly known as Königsberg. Um, uh, should politics get away sport? Oh, look, if Azerbaijan and Armenia, I mean, Mkhitaryan, remember when Arsenal were playing in the Europa League final that they lost a few years back? Refused to play in Baku because of the death threats he and his family were receiving. He feared that he could be assassinated or kidnapped over there. And it's very politically tense right now between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan. Basically, some of the former Soviet republics in Central Asia and Far Eastern Europe don't particularly like each other and have actually been in a source of conflict for 30 years, which partly accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was internal divisions within the Soviet Union before the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the eventual collapse of the Soviet former Russian Empire, basically. Um, and the fact that, yeah, Azerbaijan, I mean, that would be a bloodbath. The fans would kill each other. It would be open. It would be almost a pretext to actually launch a full-scale invasion of the other country. And Azerbaijan is exceptionally rich in oil and gas. And there's some pipelines from Azerbaijan that go through Turkey into Eastern Europe, bypassing the Nord Stream one. In a neutral venue, that the players would try and break each other's legs. It would be motivated by racial and political hatred and religious hatred, because Azerbaijan, predominantly Muslim, Armenia, predominantly Christian. Um, it wouldn't be particularly pleasant. It would be just there would be a religious and racial element to it, a nationalistic element to it. That's more than just a football match. It would become quite nasty quite quickly, and a neutral venue wouldn't satisfy either side. The players would be out to intimidate and hurt each other. Um, it wouldn't be pleasant. Not in the It would not be pleasant in the slightest. It would be quite a um, nasty event. Yeah, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Pakistan in the cricket gets. Bangladesh and Pakistan have a tasty history politically. Um, and there's issues in the Kashmir and the Punjab right now. There's been clashes. They're both nuclear states. They've had open warfare since the partition in the late 40s. Not the British government's finest hour, I will admit that, but it was forced. The hand was forced, rather than having the Raj, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh being one nation. They decided to split it into two, and eventually it became three. Um, um, yeah, there's been riots and unsavoury things. I wouldn't say all microstates. Some of the Pacific nations are very small, and buy them for the a billionaire could, look at the Neymar transfer. You could buy seven separate countries with that money, all of them in the Pacific Ocean region. So no, not all the small nations of the world are expensive. Um, San Marino, actually, they have a very high standard of living, very very high standard of living. A lot of San Marines actually work in Rimini, which is the major Italian city nearby, or Ancona, which is another major seaport, um, which is a gateway to the Adriatic. And they've got a big ceramic industry where they make ceramic tiles and pottery for building and um, pottery for household use and garden use. So they're a very skilled workforce with um, a higher average salary. San Marino's the take home pay is good. Um, the average salary is actually quite high. I don't know enough about it economically and such, but there's a reason why these small little nations like San Marino and Liechtenstein have very stable government, and very high wages, and very good investment. Um, it is, yes. Actually, it's the oldest continuous country in the world. It goes back to the 3rd century AD. Favorite flag of a country? I don't really have one. Um, um, Fun with flags with Sheldon Cooper. I don't really have one. Um, but I think each nation, obviously. No. Well, to have yeah, I think Bhutan and Nepal are quite interesting because they're just funky designs. Um, but I do like um, some of the South American ones, like Argentina and Uruguay. There's a reason why they have the sun and the blue and the light blue and white, and that's to do with the um, political origins of both countries are very, very linked. Um, uh, Bhutan has definitely got the best flag. Uh, definitely got the best flag. Not gonna lie, Bhutan definitely has a funky flag. Not gonna lie with that one. Um, but there's some pretty funky designs out there. But then you have to look at like coats of arms for towns and cities in Europe. Some of them are pretty cool as well. Um, but yeah, some of the states in the US and some of the provinces in Canada have some pretty funky flags as well. Um, and the reason why Hawaii has the Union Jack is because the last king of Hawaii likes the color of like the design of our flag. That's why they have it. Um, yeah, Cyprus and Kosovo. Cyprus, I think Cyprus could be the north and the south could fully reunite as a single political entity, and there may be the Turkish withdrawal at some point, but Erdogan has to leave office for that to happen. Erdogan's quite a nationalistic, expansionist, sees himself as the modern day Ataturk kind of Turkish president. He's not a particularly nice individual. Um, when he's overthrown or leaves office or dies in office, we may see more progression back in Turkey. Um, the issue of Cyprus and the border with Bulgaria, Greece, and Turkey. Again, Erdogan would have to not be in office for that to happen. He sees himself as the modern day Kemal Ataturk, and not as pleasant. Ataturk was actually quite a nice bloke in comparison to Recep Erdogan. Um, Brazil's got a quite cool flag over them. Yes, Brazil has quite a funky one. Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela have well very funky flags that are very similar, and you've got Bolivia, Mexico. Some of the Latin American countries have some pretty funky ones. The home nation ones are quite simple and safe. The traditional Irish flag actually is the harp, not the tricolour. It's the actual blue background with the gold harp. That's the traditional Irish flag with the provinces and counties of Ireland having symbols on it. Northern Ireland is just St George Cross with the red hat of Ulster. That's all it is. Not, there's a political element to that, and it's a very divisive. Flags in Ireland Ireland's quite divided with both north and south. Very messy politically right now, and it has been for a little while, and it's not particularly pleasant. And I have great concerns about more social division um, over the Irish Sea, which is not good. Uh, Turkey has, yeah. Well, if you go to eastern Turkey, it's not particularly pleasant. Um, yeah, it's with the position of the Kurdish community and the ongoing, um, basically their version of the Troubles or the uh, political violence. in eastern Turkey, around Lake Van and over there with the Kurdish population has been ongoing for since the 70s. It's um, quite a nastiness, and that also spills into Syria and northern Iraq and Iran. Um, Not particularly pleasant, and it's been going on for nearly 50 years. Ongoing conflict in the east, but central and western Turkey is quite developed, quite a high standard of living for a lot of people. A lot of people, not everyone, but a lot of people. Like Izmir, Ankara, and Istanbul, there's some very modern architecture, some very modern bits and pieces, but there's also some not so nice bits. More people now call it Derry than Londonderry. Londonderry is really falling out of preferred use with a lot of people. Even unionists have started to call it Derry. I call it Derry. I it, it, it the history of the city is not a nice one. Uh, there's a lot of bad things have happened in um, in that location. Yeah, look, the unification will not necessarily solve all the problems. There was a chance to solve the problems in 1914, um, and a certain assassination of Franz Ferdinand slightly put that on hold, and then they never got round to fixing it in 1980. And then the Irish Civil War starts, and the Irish War of Independence, and yeah, the Irish Free State is declared, and then the Republic of Ireland is declared after that. Tyrone and Fermanagh, basically um, local county divisions, basically. So when you have a local authority change of like a boundary, we're talking about 12 square miles of territory. That's all it boils down to, and Ireland would have had home rule, um, which would have solved a lot of problems that we see today with divided communities. Because a lot of Protestants, ironically, historically were nationalists, and a lot of Catholics, after Catholic emancipation, were actually pro-unionist. Um, Most people were politically not bothered. They just wanted to get on with their daily lives. Mental, really. Well, the Faroe Islands um, always be part of Denmark. To be honest, Svalbard and they should be really part of Norway, really. Um, Iceland used to be part of Denmark as well, and so did Greenland. Well, Greenland still is. Iceland became independent in 1944. Um, Interesting. It is interesting. Very small populations, though. Um, very small populations. Uh, I don't know on that one. I really don't know. It's up to the Danish people and the Faroese Islanders to decide and determine their future, like Iceland did. Iceland went, no, we want to be a republic and we want to be free of Copenhagen in 1944. That was part to do with World War II and the stationing of Allied troops in Reykjavik and Keflavik. Um, and they were like, yeah, no, we don't see a reason why Denmark couldn't guarantee our security. Other countries did. We would rather go alone. Um, Greenland would probably end up with Canada for political reasons. Again, it's 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 a left. It's politically it's interesting because it is classed as part of Denmark, but also not part of the nation of Denmark. Its administration is very strange. Again, a very small population, and heavily dependent on Danish government subsidy to basically survive. Yes, it's above the Arctic Circle. Parts of Greenland do not have daylight for half the year. A bit more than 18,000. I think it's about 40,000 in Greenland, but it's not a big population, vast area, but not a lot of people live there. And it's heavily dependent on Danish government subsidies, whereas the Faroe Islands actually have an economy where they are linked into Norway and Scotland via ferries and air routes, and they do have a very strong um, fishing economy, and they are on a North Atlantic trade route. Greenland is a bit more isolated, but both the Faroe Islands and uh, Greenland are heavily reliant on Danish government subsidy to prop them up. They would struggle as independent nations um, badly. Denmark doesn't want to give them up because it provides them with strategic access into the North Atlantic. Um, and well, the Faroe Islands are based pretty independently minded, but um, again, um, another reason why they haven't been taken over by other countries is, yeah, partly because that threat of Russia militarizing the Arctic, which because Denmark has a share in the Arctic because of Greenland and the Faroes, and Norway with Svalbard, even though Norway is above part, it's above the Arctic Circle. It's all political. It's set up in a way, but unfortunately, to economically survive, they are heavily subsidised by the Danish government. Much like the devolved governments here get central government funding. So politically, it's a very centrist, centre-left kind of leaning country politically. It's very progressive, very strong welfare state. Um, yeah, I would say it's very progressive in its outlook. I've met some Danish people, I, but I would say it's a pretty open-minded, welcoming country. Politically, it's not overtly right wing, not overtly left wing. It's pretty centre ground, but it's pretty progressive in a lot of the policies it's introduced since the Second World War. It's pretty stable politically. It still has a royal family, the monarch as head of state, so it's very similar constitutionally to us in the UK. Um, it's very progressive in women's rights, welfare state, maternity leave, paternity leave, uh, workers' rights, the workplace. It's quite progressive. Um, good high standard of living. A lot more emphasis on public transportation funding and cycle lanes and green energy, renewable energy sources. Big emphasis on um, urban infrastructure improvements. But again, the Danish population is not massive. It's only got a couple of big urban areas other than Copenhagen, and a large majority of the population live in a couple of big urban areas. But it's like the Nordic model. It's very similar to southern Sweden and Norway in its outlook, except it's a bit cheaper to live in than Norway. Very similar to Sweden in certain regards, in regards to women's rights, paternity and maternity leave, employment rights as well, foreign policy. It's not seen uh, as aggressive when it comes to NATO. It was obviously involved in the Afghan deployment. Um, it's also not adopted the euro. It's one of the few countries that doesn't have to adopt the euro that's a member of the EU, which is very interesting. Sweden is another one as well. Sweden and Denmark still have their version of the krona, um, and Denmark has been granted dispensation um, not to have to implement use of the euro, so we can still have the Danish krona or Danish crown, basically what krona stands for. Um, they had a referendum on it. They were when they joined the EU, they were very keen to have financial control of their currency. Um, and they've been proven right in their choice not to implement the euro as their currency, whereas Finland, another one of the Scandinavian Nordic kind of economies, even though Finland's a bit different culturally, has implemented the euro, and that has actually impacted the Finnish economy in a slightly different way. But no, economically, Sweden and Denmark, very solid economies, low unemployment, um, higher salaries than other parts of the EU. They rank pretty highly on the happiness scales as well in regards to residents' welfare and welfare levels. They rank quite highly on education. So they've invested in education infrastructure and yeah, they're Sweden and Denmark rank quite highly with happiness index and human development index. Scandinavian, they I've had a friend of mine went over to on a university exchange when she was at Brighton University many years ago. She went over to a university in central Sweden. I forget where it is for 6 months, but she is half Swedish anyway, so she already spoke a bit of Swedish. A lot of these Scandinavians learn English quite quickly as well. There's a lot of they can be difficult. It depends. Finnish is almost impossible to learn, or Swahili as they call it. But Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Icelandic's a little bit difficult. But on all intents and purposes, most of the Scandinavian countries, English is taught in schools and universities. There's a lot of Scandinavians speak very good English, um, and a lot of their place names don't really change in English anyway. There's it still be Stockholm and Gothenburg and Malmo. They just pronounce it differently. But there are, for the most part, yeah, I've heard Scandinavian languages, once you start picking them up, are quite easy to learn. And then someone from Denmark can understand someone from Sweden and Norway and to a certain extent Iceland. They can all understand each other. They're all very similar group of languages that have very similar origins because they're Viking, Nordic languages, but they're not too difficult to learn. But every um, Scandinavian person I've come across Norwegians, Swedes, Danes. Um, all of them speak very good English, um, and to a high competency level. Hello.
Hello, Bunny. How are you?
Right, hang on a sec. I'm gonna have to call it a day. Bye for now. I am all right.
Good.